All right. Excuse me. Thanks for tuning in to another installment of The War Room, where we talk about everything World War II and the history behind it. I am your host, Admiral Sigma Jones. My co host is here, Mr. Logic's Finest. And before we get started, we just want to give a shout out to our subscribers. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for tuning in. We truly appreciate the love and support. Hope you gentlemen and ladies are doing well today or tonight, depending on where you are in the world. And definitely looking forward to tonight's installment, as one of our fans, Aiza Sama, has mentioned earlier, just highlighted his comment. But yeah, definitely took a little break just to enjoy a little bit of vacation and whatnot. But now it's time to get back into the business of things, especially with these two series, The War Room and The Black Rodents of Japan. If it's not The War Room, it's Black Rodents and vice versa. So definitely enjoying these two contents and series. But without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our co-host for tonight or today, Mr. Logic's Finest. How you doing, sir?
How are you, sir?
Oh, doing really good, really well. Kind of been doing some pre-planning for tonight's installment and also some planning for the next part of the War Room series going into the summer. But other than that, it's been pretty good.
Nice. Awesome to hear that. Awesome to hear that. I was, as I told you, I was stateside for a while, so now I'm back over here on the other side of the pond, and it's good to be home.
And for the audience out there, home for Logic's Finest is Germany. And I have to say, it's definitely on my bucket list of the next countries to visit over in Europe, especially since I found out that I have some genetic heritage from Eastern Europe in regards to Germany and even Great Britain. So for him, when he says he's back home, that's what he's talking about.
Well, what they say. Home is where the heart is, and home is where you make it. So all I can say is I should have been born here, but that's a whole other conversation entirely.
Sir, I'm with you on that. More and more, I tell my folks sometimes when I see them that honestly, I should have been born in a different generation. But again, that's a totally different subject in and of itself.
It's funny that you say that. It's really funny that you say that. A wise man once told me, never correct a fool because he will hate you. Instead, if you correct a wise man, he will always appreciate you.
Hmm. That is very profound. Very profound. Even had to make me think a little bit deeper on that. Which, by the way, the series is all about elevating your mindset. So the stuff that we kind of bounce off each other, especially for the audience, definitely keep in mind the things we're talking about. It's all about elevating the mind. So that right there is definitely something even I haven't really thought of, but it still makes sense at the end of the day.
Well, there's so many ways to look at it. When you there's another and I've told you this many and numerous times. When you go down into the pit to argue with a pig, people can no longer tell the difference between you and the pig.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're all grown adults, and of course, we're all grown men and women, and you can absolutely do whatever you want. But when you argue, when you argue, fuss, and fight with people who you claim to disagree with, that you're diametrically opposed to, you end up becoming the very same thing that you claim to hate. So when you call yourself giving pushback and providing counterpoint, and you're arguing and you're fighting, and all you're doing is mirroring the very same animus and the same rhetoric and the same toxicity and the same negativity. That's all that you're doing. So where do you find the time and energy to be positive and productive and focus on yourself and on the things that you claim to espouse? But I digress.
No, sir, you are definitely spot on. For me, it comes to a point in time for individuals where yes, it's good to have opinions. It's good to have I- ideas and thoughts as far as your own self. But then the question I have to ask, what purpose do you have for yourself? And if you can't answer that with 100% certainty, that means you still got a lot of soul searching to do. And especially if you're basing your identity on external factors like other people or other ideals and whatnot. And so that's where a person just got to understand that, like you said, there's going to be people who have differences of opinion. They're not always going to agree with you. And that is perfectly fine. The thing of it is, you agree to disagree, and then you move on to bigger and better things.
Mm-hmm.
And or you find things that you agree upon and you build off of that. That's how true society functions. But
Ah, now you hit the nail on the head. And there was another concept that a lot of people simply cannot wrap their head around. What works for you may not work for me, and what works for me might not work for you, and that's fine. If we
mm-hmm.
disagree, we can agree to disagree, but do so agreeably. Whether I agree with it or not, whether I can even see it or not. If it's working for you, then hey, by all means, keep doing it. It it may not work for me. It might never work for me. But if it's working for you, then that's all that matters. And if it's working for me, then again, that's all that matters. It does not make me a bad guy or make me wrong because what I'm doing works for me, but it would never work for you. It's working. And at the end of the day, it comes back to what I just said. The time and energy you spend arguing and fighting and fussing and carrying on with someone who you claim to disagree with and have no common ground with, then I have to ask you, why spend so much time arguing, fussing, and fighting to begin with? Be positive, be productive, literally turn your back, walk away, go on about your business, and be the example that you claim to be. Live the life that you claim that you are living.
Yep.
It's the very same way that you can't talk and listen at the same time. Well, guess what? You can't argue, fuss, and fight with someone who disagrees with you and live the mindset and lifestyle that you claim to want to live at the same time. That doesn't work. Where do you find the time and energy? But again, we're all grown adults. We can all do what we feel is best for us. If that works for you, fine. Arguing, fussing, and fighting with people who disagree with me does not work for me. It's non-productive to me because you may disagree. Great, but guess what? It's working for me, and that's fine. That's fine. But see, that is such a difficult concept for so many people to wrap their heads around. It's working for you, great. It's working for me, great. It doesn't make either of us right or wrong. It's working. So carry on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of which, it actually kind of ties in with today or tonight's stream. So this is actually bittersweet. And I say that because after tonight's stream, we will pretty much finish up most of the first portion of the figureheads that we talked about. But going forward, especially into the summer months, we're going to now transition to life for these countries back in the 1920s. And we're really going to look at the cultural aspects of all of these nations during the 1920s leading up to the fall of Wall Street back in 1929. And I say that because for a lot of these countries, we're really going to see some transformations that all of them going to go through from their different perspective leading up to the end of the 1920s. And I'm really looking forward to that portion because we're going to be able to highlight how these people function in their respective societies. We're talking places in Eastern Europe, places in America, places over in Asia. We're even going to look at some things that's go on in the United Kingdom in regards to Australia and India, places that were still under the British rule. All of this plays into what the mindset of these respective countries were leading up to the fall of Wall Street. So what's your thoughts on that?
Amazing, because that brings us back to our very first episode of The War Room, where we covered Germany post World War One and after, and how the Treaty of Versailles just decimated Germany. So how it gave rise to the situation was ripe for nationalism to rebuild the country, because the country had been devastated and torn apart, and the military was not even very well looked upon, and the government was absolutely not well looked upon, and it was the end of the monarchy. So it's funny, because I was thinking about this just the other day, how the period from the end of World War One leading up to the early 30s, how that period, the effects, the outcome of that war, it shaped every nation, and it really went step to step. It was almost a direct line to creating the environment for World War Two.
Yeah, absolutely. And and SAC really touched on and talk about the national culture change in the 20s and 30s. And again, this is why I really want to focus one decade at a time because once we finish up with how these countries were functioning in the 20s, that's when we're going to really start to look at the characters that help to develop more of these figureheads that we're talking about. And especially in your case, Logic Finance, when we really get to the figureheads that helped shaped the Adolf Hitler to what he will eventually become the Führer of the Third Reich. To me, before we even get to how these characters were functioning around these figureheads, we also need to look at the cultures during these decades. That way, it lays the foundation not only for the audience, but even for other scholars and all to see this is how people were thinking during this time frame and how this change of mindset and thinking helped to influence these figureheads to eventually become the leaders of their respective countries and why they will go on to make the decisions that they make.
Absolutely, and we've said that from day one. None of these men who have been presented as monsters were born that way. They were made that way. They were shaped and molded by their environment, by events, and by their upbringing. And conversely, the men who were cast as heroes, they maybe weren't anywhere near the heroes as we've been led to believe. Because again, as the old saying goes, history is written by the victors.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And speaking of that too, so to kind of recap on the last episode where we talk a little bit of Hideki Tojo's upbringing. So it kind of goes into more details of Japan's transition from a savage nation, you could say, to a more modern and sophisticated nation. And what kind of appealed my interest, to recap from the last episode, is how you've had these figureheads within the emperor's system, especially the Meiji government, who have clearly set out in the book that in order to become a more a cultured country or to be taken seriously by other countries, you have to be modern and you have to be able to work with other countries. I really wanted to highlight that from the last episode because when we get more deeper into these last two chapters for tonight and today, we're going to see how Japan took it upon itself to become the first world power on the eastern nation of Asia, the eastern Asia side. And really, it was just a collective agreement amongst Japan that, hey, we're going to change our way of thinking and we're going to be taken seriously by other countries by adopting global mindsets.
You know, I'm so glad that you hit that nail right on the head because a country will not be taken seriously by other nations unless they adopt modern mindsets and they attempt to work with others. Now, where am I going with that? You can apply that to any underdeveloped or second or third world nation on the earth currently as of 2021. That's all the hints that I'm going to give. So you see,
Mm-hmm.
it's not hatred or skin color or legacy of things as people are constantly told. Do those things play parts? We would be naive to think that they don't, but they're not the driving force. If you're not taken seriously, then what happens to you? You know what? As far as I'm gonna go down that, because a lot of people they take it the wrong way, they get emotional, they don't want to hear anything. You get claims like you're excusing this and you're denying that and this that, and the third, and no, well, look, listen, you have the power to create the reality that you want to see. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the world that you want to see, that you want to live in, starts in the mirror first. But I digress, and I'll stop there.
Good sir, you always hit it right on the head. To me, I look at it this way, especially for those who haven't listened to the last episode, definitely get a chance to catch up on that. But I can summarize it as this. If Japan itself, a country that is at that time only consisted of maybe 50 million people, if they can go from a country of complete savagery, and what I mean by complete savagery, you can literally have your head cut off just for accidentally touching a samurai. If they can go from complete savagery to a respected modern civilization, there's no excuse for any other country in the 21st century. But I'll leave it there.
Japan was nuked, not
Mm-hmm.
once, but twice. I'm going to repeat that. Japan was nuked, not once, but twice. In 40 years, they transformed themselves to one of the five most powerful economies on the face of the earth at that time, within
Mm-hmm.
40 years. Up until the mid 90s, the 9 of the 10 largest banks in the world were Japanese. Let that sink in.
Yeah. And to this day, Japan remains the only country to have been nuked and still become a top 5 economically powered country. So chew on that for a little bit. All right. So for tonight's episode, we're going to finish up the last two chapters, chapter 5 and 6. So the previous 4 chapters, like I said, talk a little bit more about the background history of Japan, but it also kind of delved more into Hideki Tojo's father's quest to get installed into the national army and how that laid out the blueprint for Hideki himself to go into the ranks of the military. And so these last two chapters are definitely going to talk more on Hideki's side and kind of give a little bit more intel into his character. So the first paragraph of chapter 5 starts off with this: the family home to which Hidenori Tojo, the father of Hideki Tojo, returned to in 1895 was simple, almost severe. Japanese officers were expected to be a star in the image of the samurai. Economics, in any case, made ostentation or gracious living out of the question for the majority of Japanese officers who did not enjoy private means. Although as a class they might have the respect of their nation, and as individuals the deference of their neighbors, they were not highly paid. For the young Hideki, the extremes of indulgence at home and strict discipline at school, traditionally the lot of the young Japanese male, and blamed by psychologists in later days for many of the less attractive aspects of his behavior, were present in marked degree. His mother, the daughter of a Buddhist priest, has been described as, quote, a very difficult woman, given to outbursts of hysteria, unquote. She was perhaps no more difficult than might have been expected from a woman who had borne 7 children since her marriage at the age of 17, who was compelled to take in sewing work to eke out the family income, and who, because of her husband's prolonged absences, had to deal with a large family very much on her own. In this family environment, and in a society where Confucian precepts of obedience and respect for the position of an eldest son was strongly held, it is scarcely surprising that as a schoolboy, Hideki Tojo exhibited many of the traits of the spoiled brat. So, I like this particular two paragraphs because, once again, we now see similar traits as Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, Benito Mussolini, and even Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Almost cut and paste. Just in these two paragraphs, we're now seeing similar traits that even Hideki Tojo shared with the other figureheads.
It's amazing. I mean, at this point, the both of us just literally sound like broken records because every one of these gentlemen, different backgrounds, different countries, how different financial and or religious backgrounds, yet upbringings remarkably similar. Situations within the home remarkably similar. Each one of these men, it's like they were like it's like they were, I hate to use that word, but it's like they were destined to become who they were and meet and become the men because as I've always said, the way I really look at it, you can really boil World War II down to 15 to 20 men. It was the will and decisions of 15 to 20 men, and the world around them followed the wills of these individuals. So if you look at how these men were shaped, none of them were born that way. They were all created, all built over time with remarkable similar backgrounds and situations. Amazing.
Yeah, and you're right. I look at how, in the case of Hideki Tojo, you had a father who, once again, was absent from the home, but unlike his other figureheads who they were absent because of their choices, hint hint, Hidenori Tojo was absent because, well, he is in the military. And at the time, Japan was really building up its military to expand to other countries. Therefore, as a lieutenant, his father, he couldn't really be home that much. But again, no matter what, it's still the same aspect and traits. You have a father who was less involved in the young children's life. You have a mother who, in the case of Hideki Tojo, not only do you have to be the single mother and raise 9 children by yourself, or excuse me, 7 children, but you also got to adhere to the strict precepts of Confucius thinking in East Asia, let alone Japan. So that boils up to a very hostile environment, even for a Japanese environment like Hideki Tojo.
And again, carbon copy, cut and paste from Adolf to El Duce to Stalin to Churchill to FDR. Cut and paste.
Mm-hmm.
The home environment, the father, the mother, the siblings, cut and paste.
Yeah,
All we need now is just General Tojo wanting to go to the seminary and be an artist, and that's it. Complete. Cut, copy, and paste. All of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last paragraph did end by saying that although he grew up in an environment of obedience and respect as the eldest son, as a schoolboy, he exhibited many other traits of a spoiled brat.
As, as did every other leader that we've talked about. They were all the same. As the old saying goes, what is it? Birds of a feather flock together, even if they end up on opposing sides.
Yeah, it's amazing. All right. The next paragraph says he was opinionated, obstinate, and quick to pick a fight. On the credit side, having got into one, he showed considerable personal courage and tenacity in seeing it through. At school, he was no more than an average student, but comparison with relatively carefree standards in Britain or the United States would be entirely misleading. The Japanese schools of Tojo's youth were relentlessly competitive in character, and there was no nonsense either in studies or sport about it, no mattering if you won or lost, but how you played the game. Nor was there anything like the Western tradition of commiseration with the loser. Losers were weepers, and, very often, suicidal. Now, as someone who has a chance to deal with Japanese people on a regular basis, especially with my friends and senseis, they have unanimously have told me that the schools that they've gone through from kindergarten all the way up to even college, every year was a competitive year. School was taken very seriously. And it's something how, as Japan adopted Western ideals during this time frame, they took education very seriously. And like the author pointed out, even though Hideki Tojo was an average student at best in his youth, by standards of Western schools, he was definitely above average if it was compared to students that went to more public schools, especially those from the United States. Hint, hint. But I digress.
Yeah, I mean, we all know, we're all aware of the preconception of the stereotype of Asians, no matter which country your background is, doing very well in school, very high
Mm-hmm.
in math and the sciences. You know, that perception comes from somewhere. That stereotype comes from somewhere. Take it for what it is, but it comes from somewhere. It has most certainly been my experience. I was younger, growing up, seeing exactly that. So,
Yeah, absolutely. The next paragraph says In his youth, he suffered more than usually from the bad complexion, which is so often the bane of adolescence. He was short sighted, and his physique generally such as to cause wonder, when he entered a militarily preparatory school at the age of 15, at how he could ever have aspired to be a soldier. At the school, it quickly became apparent that the injunction of the Tokugawa shogun Ieyasu to his subjects, quote, avoid things you like, turn your attention to unpleasant duties, unquote, had particular meaning for him. With no outstanding ability, plain hard work would be necessary to keep up with or beat the other students. He developed a morbid capacity for it, applying himself to such effect that he excelled colleagues possibly more gifted intellectually, but lacking his own driving intensity of purpose. His success left him with a humorless, almost superstitious belief in the dividends of application and the power of will. Quote, I am just an ordinary man possessing no shining talents, he later told a group of students. Anything I have achieved, I owe to my capacity for hard work and never giving up. So, what we see here, we see a young man, a young boy at this time, only 15, a teenager, who on the outside definitely was not physically talented. He was one where, from all understandings and firsthand knowledge, nobody think he would go on to become bigger or better from an intellectual standpoint. But just similar to the likes of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he had a mindset of, I have an idea of what I want to do and I'm going to go and get it. And so if he had to outwork the more talented students, that was he was known for, being able to outwork his opponent.
Absolutely. And it's funny because most people in the world, I want to say 30 and under, you were born into PC culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a term that I first saw in the late 80s when I was in high school. So where I'm going with this is, during the war, political propaganda was looked at very differently, and ethnic stereotypes were much more widely accepted. So in America, there was a derogatory term for Japanese. They either call them Japs, or they call them Nips, or they call them Tojo.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were a Japanese soldier, you were a Tojo, and that was directed because at derived from General Tojo, who was the commanding officer of the Imperial Japanese Army. So in print media, and the stereotype of a Japanese soldier, in fact, a Japanese person, was that they were of short stature, skinny, had round glasses, and a short mustache. Basically, a caricature of General Tojo. So I say all that to say that his influence was such that he was the blueprint, or the subject matter for the source of derogatory material directed towards the Japanese military and the Japanese people at large.
Yep.
Just
Absolutely.
a little quick segue.
No, absolutely. And I didn't even know that until now, that that was used as a more derogatory term, which, as you said, those under 30s brought up in a world where it's more PC, you wouldn't expect that calling a Japanese person Tojo because they're hardworking and they're diligent with their studies and all. You know, a younger person myself would think that, oh, that would be a compliment, being that, Tojo is hardworking, and if you even just exclude as far as his military life and all, just the mere fact that he was extra attention to his studies, that's admirable. But then again, as you rightly pointed out, because we're more in a PC environment, we would never expect that. Whereas back then, that's what that term was used in regards of the Japanese. Hey, you're a Tojo, and that's not something as far as a good compliment and all. So again, this is a good opportunity of you're learning something new and a nugget in why history is important.
And also, on something else in life, if you want an extraordinary result, you have to develop an extraordinary mindset. So, when faced with any adversity, General Tojo never said, "I'm too short, I'm too skinny, I already wear glasses, I'm not physically strong or physically adept as anyone else." He said, "Okay, fine. Those are all roadblocks, those are all barriers. Guess what? All roadblocks are meant to be gone over, steamrolled over. Barriers are meant to be broken through. Closed doors meant to be opened." Okay? Hint, 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 hint for all those listening. You know? He never said, "Oh, woe is me. I can't do this. These things are in my way." No. He elevated his thinking and he developed an extraordinary mindset. And we see how his life, the trajectory it was on before Japan lost the war. My point is, all of these men, these leaders that we discussed, each one developed an extraordinary mindset to achieve extraordinary results in life. Because no, all of them had physical challenges. They weren't the fastest, they weren't the greatest in sports, weren't the brightest, but they said, "You know what? Listen, there is no time for woe is me. I can't do this. Someone wants to hold me down and hold me back. I'm going to elevate my thinking and do what I have to do to create the reality that I want to see."
Absolutely. And that actually ties in with a question that H just asked about, wouldn't that person exhibit a case of external mindset? In this case, no. Tojo realized that he couldn't, talent wise, match up with those who are more physically gifted as he was. So in his case, his belief was, well, if I'm going to become somebody in life, I got to work much harder than the next person. So he wasn't doing it to base his existence off of somebody else or some ideal. This is something that, as Logic Finance just pointed out, he just had an extraordinary way of thinking that really propelled him to the figurehead that he will eventually become as the Prime Minister of Japan, Imperial Japan.
There you go. I can't add on to what you just said. You hit it out the park.
All right. The next paragraph says, in 1902, Cadet Tojo entered military academy, having chosen the infantry as his arm of service. In the ordinary course of events, he would have stood with other successful graduates 3 years later at a commissioning ceremony, probably witnessed by his father with the grave approbation proper to one who was now a full colonel. But events were fast moving to a crisis in Japanese history. Over on the mainland, the turbulent Koreans, sometimes described as, quote, the Irish of the Far East, unquote, had been taken no more kindly to Japanese protection than they had to that of their erstwhile Chinese overlords, and were showing signs that they took their newly gained autonomy far more literally than their Japanese liberators had ever envisioned. It was a situation that the Tsarist government was quick to exploit. In 1903, Russian troops, despite angry Japanese protests, moved down from their Manchurian bases into North Korea, ostensibly to protect a forestry concession granted them by the Korean government in Seoul. The Japanese, with the Russians' part in the Triple Intervention of 1895 still rankling, were in no mood to step down again. And this time, they were not alone. A 5-year treaty with Great Britain had been negotiated when Britain was fighting the South African Boers, hint hint, and wanted Japanese support if any of the European powers attempted to take advantage of the situation in the Far East. This treaty now ensured that no such European combination of nations as had threatened in 1895 would intervene in a Russo-Japanese showdown. On the evening of the 8th of February, 1904, while their diplomats were still negotiating in Moscow, a Japanese battle fleet struck at the Russian Pacific Squadron lying at anchor in Port Arthur. Just as in the assault on the Chinese 10 years before, and as it was to happen at Pearl Harbor 37 years later, the Japanese attacked without formal declaration of war. This was not made until the 10th of February, and by that time, with Japanese troops closing in on the Russian garrison in Port Arthur, the eldest Tojo had once more gone to war. Now, I like the part where the author mentions about the South African Boers War. And salute to Blaze and San P. Good to see you, sir. And I'm thinking to myself, the Boers War. Where have we heard that so far in our series? Oh, yeah. Winston Churchill. The guy who made a false tale about his heroic efforts in the Boers War.
Oh, you mean a lie?
Yes, sir. A lie that, to this day, I'm just like, wow. They literally let him get away with this lie, even though he committed treason in his falsification.
Well, you know what? I'll say this. Here's what I learned back during the Iran-Contra hearings. I watched them every day, and I learned one thing: that as long as you have the right friends, you can literally do anything, and you will get away. You will get off. You can get away with murder, genocide, dealing drugs, anything. As long as you have the right friends. The rule of law means absolutely nothing. As long as you have the right friends. In government. That's what I mean. Specifically in government. As long as you have the right friends. In government or the wealthy who control governments.
Well, as the saying you, sir, rightfully always say and continue to say to this day, follow the money.
Because when you follow drugs, you're going to end up with drug dealers. But when you follow the money, there's no telling where you're going to end up.
Exactly. So next we go to the final chapter of tonight, chapter 6. And this is where things get a little bit more detailed in regards to the Russo-Japanese War. So it starts off by saying the war against the Russians was for the Japanese an unbroken series of brilliant victories on land and sea over an enemy established as a world power since the days of Peter the Great, and on paper disposing of infinitely greater strength. On land, the Russian soldiers fought with stubborn courage, but still thought and acted in terms of a static Crimea-type war. The Japanese moved rapidly, attacking relentlessly under officers like Hideki Tojo, trained by Prussian instructors in the tactics that had scythed through the French lines at Sedan. Superbly disciplined, they performed epic deeds of valor without regard to casualties. Port Arthur finally fell after a long and costly siege on the 31st of December, 1904. Field Marshal Oyama took Mukden, the Manchurian capital, on the 16th of March, 1905. When the Russians tried to reinforce their Far Eastern Navy by dispatching their Baltic fleet to the Far East, it was met on the 27th of May, 1905, by the force under Admiral Togo, lying in wait for it in the Tsushima Straits, and was shattered in a 2-day battle. Now, this is interesting because the Russo-Japanese War, and this was a prelude war for the Japanese before they officially entered World War One. This was very significant because here you have a small country in the likes of the Japanese who literally beat a world power country in the likes of Russia pretty much to a beatdown. Now, some scholars will say, well, the reason why the Japanese were able to get away with beating the Russians is because during this time frame, as we later read in Joseph Stalin's period, the Russians were going through a revolution. And so, despite the fact that they had some foreign policies going on overseas and in other countries as far as, dealing with hostile environments, they were also dealing with domestic issues that really caused the Russians to focus more inward than outward. So for some scholars, they would say that was beneficial for the Japanese because the Russians wasn't able to kind of put all their efforts into defeating the Japanese. But nevertheless, it was definitely a David and Goliath moment where the Japanese actually proved themselves to be a formidable opponent against the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War. And that would later play divide us into why the Americans took the Japanese very seriously following the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I think that, clearly, when one studies history, Japan militarily proved itself over and over and over again. And I think that each victory made them more and more aggressive and warlike, because it got to the point where, if you look at the scope of what Japan wanted to do, and really General Tojo wanted to do, because he was practically calling the shots in the government leading up to the war. One scratches your head like, well, how does this little tiny country made up of several large islands, where do they have these delusions of grandeur almost? But if you look at their military victories, they basically developed the mindset that, hey, listen, we can do anything because we won and we've never been beaten. Consistently taking on much larger foes. So we're going to do it again.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, again, it shows how when you have a country that is collective and and really trying to prove itself on a world stage, things like this will definitely start to have other countries take you more seriously. But again, it takes a nation to really be on a same mindset. Now, let me preface by saying this. There's a difference between a nation that is being collective in regards to building for a better future versus the whole everybody got to think monolithic thought. I say that because you will have detractors who will say, well, see, they all thought the same. They all got to think monolithically and all, and that's how you can build a nation and go forward. Not quite, not quite. See, the Japanese still held on to Western ideals. And because they believe in the Western ideals and wanted to take a more global mindset, they took that advantage to prove themselves on the world stage. Very different when you want to be monolithic in regards to the world owes you something.
Oh, oh. Um, I'm going to approach this from a different angle, from a complementary angle. Let me be clear, from a complementary angle to what you just said. So, when your culture has a mindset, when your culture is positive and productive, and by all intents and purposes, and all metrics is normal and regular, then as a group, you can pull together and you can accomplish wonders. Whether they're positive or negative, whether they're good or bad, you let history be the judge of that. Counterculture is counterproductive. If your culture is based upon, well, we're just going to be the opposite of whatever the predominant culture is, history is proven that's counterproductive. And it's childish and it's emotional and it's reactionary
Mm-hmm.
rather than being positive and productive and normal. So if you're going to operate inside of a system, you have to learn how to operate within that system or create a system to completely and totally replace that system. However, if you're going to tell me that the system that you're creating to replace the current dominant system, its only merit is that it's completely opposite, well, as they say in the South, that dog don't hunt, right? Isn't what they say. But I digress.
Absolutely. And before I continue, Ace has the question: isn't that different regarding Japan's mindset from the people leaders and the situation in terms of its culture in comparison to America's? Not quite. So again, well, one thing, let's put it like this. It's hard to compare a country like Japan to a multi-ethnic country like America.
Mm.
So for Japan, they was able to pretty much be on the same mindset from the leaders all the way down to the merchants or even the lowest person. So for them, it was much easier to decide, hey, we're going to take education seriously. We're going to take productivity more seriously. We're going to do things, as Logic Finance just pointed out, more productive to be considered a world leader in the eyes of other nations. Whereas in a place like America, even during this time frame, America is a melting pot of other cultures and ethnicities. So even though yes, you can have a more nationalistic type of productivity, it's going to be hard to have people be on the same mindset when, unfortunately, and I don't like saying this, but you have people that even during this time frame, they see race as a big issue. And even though I still don't think it's that big of an issue even in today's time, but that was one of the hurdles that would keep a nation from being able to be more productive.
Again, I'm going to approach this from a complementary angle. So when you have a country where the
Mm-hmm.
cultural mindset, the majority of the population shares the same cultural mindset, the same overarching cultural mindset. Whereas in from the beginning, you have to understand America from the beginning was several different cultural mindsets. So you had the Dutch first, then the British, then Irish came, then Italians came, and then other nationalities came. So over time, you had several different, at times conflicting, but several different cultural mindsets. So America has never really had one overarching central cultural mindset. There have been several um, goals for the masses, the quote unquote American dream and this ideal, and so on and so forth. But America, in that regard, people keep trying to compare apples to oranges when you're comparing, America, which in its current form has really been around since the 1700s, compared to some of these countries which have been around 1,000, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. You're really comparing. So when you look at it from an anthropology standpoint, you're really comparing apples to oranges. So um, to not to put too fine of a point on it, but what you're looking at more from what Ace, to answer your question is that's more of a population control question more so than a cultural mindset question.
Mm-hmm.
If you'll forgive my rather long-winded explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely summarize that there where again, it's hard to compare apples and oranges as Blaze rightfully pointed out. This is a topic of a homogeneous nation versus a heterogeneous nation. So hard to compare apples and oranges when they're just two separate fruits, even from this point in time. But again, not too bad of a question, but definitely it's just one of those things where is is something where you have to look at it from a different case standard.
Right, because when you're looking at America again in its current form, it's really only been around since the 1700s. So over
Mm-hmm.
time, it was always taking bits and pieces of Dutch culture, of British culture, of Irish culture, of Italian culture, of French culture. So when you're taking bits and pieces and you have this melange, you know, again, it's apples and oranges.
Yep, absolutely. So next paragraph, it says in Japan, patriotic enthusiasm was fever high, increasing with every victory. Nowhere was it higher than in the military academy, where Hideki Tojo had celebrated his 21st birthday on the day before Port Arthur was taken, and where he and his fellow cadets impatiently awaited the time when they could join their embattled fathers and eldest brothers overseas. For the young Tojo, that day came just after the fall of Mukden, when he was commissioned second lieutenant. The young officers who strapped on their samurai style swords and sailed for Manchuria in the spring of 1905 set out with high hopes that they would go side by side with their triumphant countrymen on the flood tide of victory. But what Hideki Tojo and most of them were to know of the Russo Japanese War was to be the boredom of garrison duty and the frustration of seeing their chances of battle taken away in the anticlimax of a negotiated peace. All the victories on land and sea and patriotic fervor in the homeland could not change the fact that by not taking Port Arthur quickly after their surprise blow, Japan had missed the opportunity of the speedy and decisive victory she needed. The glittering military successes and the heroic sacrifices of her soldiers and sailors, in somber terms of manpower and economics, had mounted to a cost of pyrrhic proportions. So here we see that, again, the Japanese were starting to really make a name for themselves. And for the young cadets like Tojo, they really wanted to get in on the action and really prove themselves to the world. But then it's almost like, again, copy and paste. They did something very similar to what the Germans did at the end of World War One. All of a sudden, the war just abruptly ended, and now there's peace.
Absolutely. This is why I love studying history, because history is written by the victors, but when you go through the history yourself, it never ceases to amaze me how much of what is taught in schools and what is put in news reports and documentaries, how much of it is abject lies or falsifications or half truths. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, you're right. And this is why, to me, I'll tell anybody, if you want to learn about true history, you have to do your own research. You have to get your nose inside the book, inside the cover of a book. Only then will you be able to find what they don't teach you in the classrooms. Because I'm going to just be honest. Growing up in middle school, grade school, high school, and even a little bit in college, I was only given, you could say, a surface understanding of the likes of the people of World War II, the figureheads that we're talking about in these series and all. But it wasn't until I decided, you know what? I want to do more research on them. I want to see what their personalities are like. What why they made these decisions, why they thought the way they thought. It was only when I decided to do my own research that I started to put more of a human face to a lot of these figureheads.
Mm-hmm.
Even a human face to Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini. And that's why I really wanted the series to be grounded on the fact of put all your emotions aside, look at these individuals for who they are, far as their background growing up, and then try to understand why they thought the way they thought.
It's funny that you say that, because when I tell people Adolf Hitler wasn't a monster, they look at me as if I'm growing five heads. I tell them Adolf wasn't the monster. The monster was a person who was nowhere near to him.
Mm-hmm.
Reinhard Heydrich, who was one of the top lieutenants, the top sub-commanders to Heinrich Himmler, the director of the SS.
Mm-hmm.
Hitler asked Himmler, "What do I do with all of these Jews? I want to get rid of them." He had no intentions of killing them in those mass numbers, tens of millions. That's unheard of. You can't bury that many bodies. So, what do I do with them? No country wants them. Nobody wants to take them. What do I do with them? Himmler said, "Mein Führer, I will get back to you." He posed the question to basically his second in command, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich came back 2 days later with a proposal on his desk, the final solution to the Jewish question. Reinhard Heydrich were literally the architects behind the final solution. It was his plan from top to bottom. He read it, he liked it, he put it on Hitler's desk, he read it, said, "Okay, go with it," and he greenlit it. Not to absolve responsibility, but he wasn't the monster. So you have to ask the question: who is the monster? The man who approves the plan, or the man who creates it from top to bottom? And even at the Swansea conference, which was to create the logistics of exactly how the final solution would work, Reinhard Heydrich detailed exactly the logistics of how this is going to work, where they were going to build the concentration camps, how they were going to get there, how they were going to operate, everything. That's your monster. I say all that to say this.
Hmm.
When you see these things, you begin to understand where people come from. And not only
Hmm.
does it put the human face on people, and you see how they were created and not built, you also begin to learn who were the real monsters. Because very often it wasn't the person on top, it was people under them. It was the zealots. Those were the real monsters.
Yep. And this is just a segue also into the next part of the series when we kind of look into the 1920s. We're also going to look into the background of a lot of these individuals who, as you pointed out, were more of a monsters than these figureheads themselves. But before I continue, I definitely want to touch on the topic when you said which was worse, the man who approved the plan for the killing, or the man who actually created the plan. And it reminded me of a question of a YouTuber that has made mention of this a while back, and he asked, which is worse, a person who tells you I'm going to kill you, or the person who actually goes out and tries to kill you?
Well, I honestly have no clue who you're talking about, but to my mind, the person who actually kills you is a hell of a lot worse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, listen, I can tell you that I don't like you or I want to get rid of you, but the guy who actually does something about it and tries to kill you, that's the bad guy.
Indeed. Indeed. All right. The next paragraph says the loss of over 200,000 men had bled White Japan's capacity to provide trained replacements. The politicians at home were realizing too, even if the soldiers and civilians did not, that patriotism was not enough. The national treasury was empty. International credit was exhausted. For the second time, the Meiji government was forced to bow to the inevitable. An approach was made to President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States to use his good offices in bringing the war to an end. The fact that this overture was made by their own government was unknown to the broad mass of the Japanese people, who knew only of the triumphs and were ecstatically confident that complete victory over the Russians was just within their grasp. When the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth, signed on the 5th of September 1905, was made known, the anger in Japan exceeded even that of the time of the Triple Intervention. Japan had got the Russians out of Korea, the issue on which the war had been fought, and regained the treaty rights in Manchuria taken away by the Triple Intervention. Russia had ceded the southern half of the Sakhalin Island with its valuable fishing grounds, but no war indemnity, as traditionally exacted from vanquished by victor, was to be paid by the Russians. So here we see that almost similar to how how the Germans felt when their leaders went behind closed doors and made deals that abruptly ended the First World War. Here we have the Japanese realizing that being a small nation, they couldn't really take advantage of an all out war. They exhausted most of their resources at this point. This is time to make a back end deal. And it caught the whole Japanese mass by surprise that, wait a minute, we on the verge of beating a world power in the likes of Russia, and now we're suing for peace?
You know, a little quick background for anyone who doesn't know. There's a reason why Sigmund Jones mentioned Germany and after the war. So the country is now known as Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland
Mm-hmm.
were all at one time part of the former German Empire. So Germans were none too happy that they had to give up the land, a part of their country. So Hitler, when Adolf came to power, he always had it in his mind to regain what he saw as lost territory, which is why when he started the war, he sailed the ship into the port of Danzig in Poland and opened fire, and that's what started the war, because he wanted to re-annex Poland and Czechoslovakia, which he saw as German land. They were part of the former German Empire. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why Sid don't mention that. And so that very same mindset, as he said, when you Japanese were emboldened by their continuous military victory, military victory, military victory. So it's only human nature when you become emboldened. So now it's like, peace. No, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
It's the very same thing. Again, if you are a person, if you're under 30, or even in your mid 30s, you don't remember the national mindset during the first Gulf War. When it came over the news saying that the war was over after 6 or 7 days, everyone was like, "What? What are you talking about?" Months of build up. We've had like a week now. We're steamrolling everything. No, you're going to go to Baghdad. You're going to go and get Saddam Hussein, and you're going to finish what we started.
Mm-hmm.
So I highlight that to put a finer point on what Sigmund just brilliantly said. As a nation, people become emboldened by continued military success. That's a human thing. That is not a uniquely Japanese thing.
Exactly. And and reason I brought that up too, in regards with the Germans back in World War I, on many accounts, and many scholars will actually back this up and saying, towards the end of the war, the Germans were actually on the verge of victory, and they were building up to really overtake the Britons and the French as far as in the trenches and all. But then all of a sudden to just abruptly end the war and say that, hey, we sue for peace, and oh, by the way, we owe this much in back pay to the British and the French and all these other nations. It was literally a slap in the face to a nation that, by all accounts, they were getting ready to turn the tide of the war.
It's funny you say that. The largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Jutland, even though the British Royal Navy lost more ships than the Imperial German Navy, they tried to spin it as a British victory. And then the Kaiser went and signed a deal and basically surrendered and gave up the war. Admiral Hipper felt betrayed, and he gave the order to scuttle the fleet rather than hand the ships over to the British.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And salute to J.J. Wilson. Good to see you, sir. The next paragraph says, for the Japanese, there was only one explanation for which their government, to its lasting discredit, made no effort to correct. Japan had once again been cheated by Western intervention, and this time their fury was turned on the Americans. Again, the ultra nationalists whipped themselves into a frenzy of rage. In Tokyo, rioting crowds demonstrated, attacking police boxes and setting fire to streetcars, and the ugly situation was brought under control only by the declaration of martial law. In Manchuria, where the hardships of fighting in a bleak fastness had inspired a Japanese version of, quote, It's a long way to Tipperary, unquote, in a dirge-like ballet which told of, quote, a lonely country far from home, unquote. Most of the conscripts were as glad as any soldier in the world at the thought of getting back to wives and families. This sentiment was not shared by their regular officers. Conscious only of the army's achievements and what these had meant in sacrifice, they knew even less than the people at home of the hard facts which had cut short the war and their chances of military luster. For Hideki Tojo and other newly commissioned regular officers, too, there was more than just the prospect of death or glory snatched from them. The opportunity of quick promotion, probable in war, was now replaced by the certainty of waiting in the slow moving queue for routine peacetime advancement. So, once again, it just highlights the fact that you had soldiers who, at least on the front lines, they were saying that, oh, we're about to get ready to overtake our enemy. We're about ready to turn the tide of war. And then just out of nowhere, they get calls from the higher ups that, hey, the war is over. Time to go back home. And it's funny how both for the Germans and the Japanese in this case, the ultra nationalists literally took advantage of a situation where a war that looked like it was going to be promised to victory was suddenly snatched out of their hands. Your thoughts, good sir?
Several. So you have to understand, as a person, when you're trained to do a job, you train, you spend all your time, train, prepare, you drill, you prepare, you make all necessary study and preparation. You want to do what it is that you've been trained to do. So whether it is changing tires, designing bridges, or fighting people as a soldier, you want to do what it is that you were trained to do. So people have to understand that mindset, the mindset of a soldier, of a warrior. Your purpose in life is to fight. It's what you do. So when you have the opportunity taken from you, okay, I'm approaching this from a more existential point of view. Because, I tend to look at the world from a more existential standpoint, So the next thing is looking at it from a culture and a society. When you produce individuals who are by design are chosen to be productive. Let me back that up. When you are produced to do something, you want to do it. So if that's to be productive, you want to be productive. If that is to be non-productive, guess what? You want to be non-productive. Why? Because that's what the culture and society is geared for. It's what that culture and society has produced. So in a normal functioning society, you want to be productive. In a non-productive and non-functional society, you want the opposite.
So it's almost like saying, especially for the unproductive society, when you have individuals who their whole life they were lazy and, so to speak, blame a lot of their failures in society because of some external factor, all of a sudden they're told that, hey, here's an opportunity for you to do better and be better. That all of a sudden it just rocks their whole world and disregards everything that they were taught to believe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the funny thing is, again, if you look at this from a existential point of view, or even if you don't even have to elevate your thinking that high, look at it from a purely anthropologic um, anthropology basis. If that's what that culture has produced, then you want to do what you were produced or created to do. If it's to be
Mm-hmm.
productive, you want to be productive. If it is to be non-productive, you want to continue being non-productive. And anything that runs opposite to that, you're going to rebel against. So, if you were created and produced to be non-productive, and now you're being told that you have to be productive, which is a good thing, but you were produced to be non-productive, so in your backwards mind, you rebel against being and thinking productive.
Oh boy, I just had a thought that just went in the rabbit hole, but we'll save that for another time.
Yeah, because we're like way off topic than where we like to be with this series, and that's my fault.
Oh,
Apologies.
no, no problem at all, sir. No problem at all. The next paragraph says the elder Tojo returned early after the peace, a sick man. Not all the casualties in the Japanese ranks had been from bayonets or gunfire. No less than 27,000 had perished from disease, and Hidenori Tojo never entirely recovered from the after effects of beriberi, contracted in the campaign. For those who don't know, beriberi is a type of disease where if you eat too much of white rice without proper nutrition, you can actually catch a certain disease where your immune system is depleted because it's not getting enough nutrition. So for the Japanese, they had this disease called beriberi. And it says his son stayed on to complete his tour of garrison duty in Manchuria and only returned in 1906. 3 years later, he married Katsu Ito, a young lady from Kyushu who, at the time of their wedding, was a student at a woman's college in Tokyo. The 19-year-old Katsu was a relatively emancipated young lady for a Japanese girl of the period, and it was generally agreed by all who knew her that she was not cast to settle down to the self-effacing role of a Japanese wife. Daughter of a small landowner who was active in local politics in Kyushu, she was one of a minority of women in her day who had aspired to higher education. Quote, "You could say that I tend to be headstrong," she admitted, "and I don't take easily to having my mind changed." Unquote. Also untypical in the match of this girl with a mind of her own and the stiff-necked, uncommunicative young Hideki Tojo was the manner of their marriage. Theirs was not the loveless contract of the traditional Japanese arranged marriage of partners picked out by their parents. Through mutual friends, Katsu was being sponsored by the Tojo family while in Tokyo and often visited the household. Hideki Tojo, very soon after their first meeting, had taken the initiative, indicating to his parents that this girl he wanted to marry. Tojo's mother, although she had taken a liking to the girl and yielded to her son's wishes, was not prepared entirely to overlook the unconventional nature of the match. For some time, the Tojo parents declined to enter Katsu's name in the family register, perhaps thinking that the marriage would not last. The Japanese mother-in-law was, in any case, able by custom to exercise almost tyrannical power over a young bride, and the elder Mrs. Tojo was not an easy person to get on with. For some time, Katsu wondered if it would not, after all, be better for everyone if she left, but her husband's kindness persuaded her to stay. Despite this early opposition, or perhaps because of it, the union was a genuinely happy one. Katsu bore the first of their 7 children in the Tojo family house in Tokyo in 1911. 17 years after Tojo's death, she recalled her husband with sorrow and affection. So here we see a young couple, Hideki Tojo and Katsu Ito, were on paper definitely it didn't look like they would be a match. Katsu was more of a headstrong, has her own opinion type of lady, which was not typical of Japanese women even by today's standards. And you had the more quiet but do the work behind the scenes type of Tojo. But by all accounts, from reading these few paragraphs, they seem to be genuine about their marriage, which it was hard to say for the likes of FDR, Benito Mussolini.
Well, my takeaway, yet again, a normally functioning culture and society is a strength and a backbone to the productivity of that nation as a people. When you don't have a normally functioning culture and society, and you have the opposite, you have counterculture, or some other culture that is non-productive, its sole reason for being is just to be opposite of the normally functioning culture and society. That is non-productive. It is counterproductive. Counterculture is counterproductive. And yet again, we have so many examples of the strength that is a normally functioning and productive culture and society.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no other way to frame it. There's no other way to state it. We can most certainly, a person can most certainly disagree with what I'm saying. Fine. We can agree to disagree and do so agreeably. But on this, we can most certainly, I would ask you, you disagree. You think I'm wrong? Prove me wrong. Disagreement on this is not enough. Because history is replete of examples. Okay, go right ahead.
Oh, no. You definitely was spot on. Essentially, I think this is a perfect example of, despite them being opposite in personality, they had a common goal when it came to family. And because they came from a culture that promotes family, it was easier for them to put their differences aside and build within a family, which this is why we always say here, culture matters.
Culture. You cannot have intelligence. You know what? I won't even go there. Let's just carry on.
Yes, sir. The next paragraph starts with a quote. There is still not one day when I don't think of my husband. Every morning I go to the family altar where his picture is, and my tears flow. Not because it is painful to recollect memories of him, but because he was a warm person. He was a man of a few words, and he did not fully express himself, so people did not always understand him. When he was alive, I always consulted him before I did anything. I wasn't forced to, but I knew it would please him. And from the bottom of my heart, this was what I wanted to do. Even now, I try to do what he would want. For instance, they are repairing the road in front of the house now. I give the laborers tea in the morning, and at noon, and perhaps cook some noodles with eggs later for them. It is almost as if I could hear my husband say, "It is good to be nice to people." He liked that sort of thing. I want to pause here real quick because that quote was actually from Katsu not too long after Hideki Tojo was sentenced to death. And you could just read that paragraph. And again, this shows a more human side to even a dictator like Hideki Tojo. Was there some things that he done wrong that he probably wish he could take back? Of course. But again, this is a perfect example of what they won't show you in the history books in schools and all. And for the most part, I'm glad that they wrote this down in his biography to really show that despite the type of person he was portrayed abroad and in public, that he had a human side. And she respected him as a man. Despite him being a man of few words and maybe not getting quick to temper, per se, at least around her, but you could just read from that paragraph that she respected him as a man. And I'm going to say this, and I won't go too much down the rabbit hole, but for men out there, there's really a world of difference when you have a woman who not only loves you, but respects you as a man. And I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely. I second that emotion, and we're just going to carry on.
All right. The next paragraph says, with the responsibility of marriage and a family, and the example of his father, who had risen to the rank of a general, the pressure of Hideki Tojo to succeed was greater than ever. Still a second lieutenant, with a medal and not so much more to show for his service overseas, he applied himself more grimly than before to his profession, working long hours with obsessional concentration. Routine promotion to full lieutenant came at the age of 23, and 6 more years were to pass before he attained the rank of a captain. Nevertheless, proof came, if he needed it, of the rightness of his creed of hard work when he was selected for a vacancy on the coveted staff officers course. He was approaching 30 when he graduated from staff college, but with his staff qualification, he was at least assured of not being compulsorily retired at an early age, and was apt to happen to less successful Army officers. In the meantime, for the nation, an era had passed. In 1912, the revered Emperor Meiji had died, bringing an end to the eventful period in Japanese history that bore his name. His demise was marked by great public mourning, highlighted by the suicides of General Nogi and his wife by Harakiri, as a gesture of grief for the passing of their lord in the tradition of the ancient samurai retainers. It was well known that the chivalrous and gallant victor of Port Arthur also intended his death to atone for the terrible loss of life among those, including his 2 own sons, who fought under him. So it's interesting that Emperor Meiji, not only was his reign as emperor considered one of the greatest aspects of Japanese history into modernization, he was also the second longest reigning emperor in the history of Japan. Only his grandson, Emperor Hirohito, had a longer reign on the throne than himself. But it's interesting that despite his major tribute to the modernization of Japan, I was surprised to find out that his grave, which is a few meters outside of Kyoto, uh, it is almost like it was just a regular grave for a commoner, which I find that to be interesting.
Yeah, I know. I read that too, man, and I'm speechless, especially when you consider that there was a special shrine, is it a memorial where um officers who officers who died or who lived exhibiting exemplary service to the emperor, they're memorialized for all time at this shrine, and um,
Mm-hmm.
General Tojo is honored there. So if General Tojo, my point is, if General Tojo got that kind of honor, you wouldn't honor Emperor Meiji in the same manner because the Meiji era is the transformation of Japan from feudal Japan to modern day Japan.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what was very complexing for me was the fact that wow, an emperor who, from all historical accounts, both domestic and foreign, this man literally helped change Japan within 2 decades to go from a savage nation to a nation that's well respected on modern terms. But yet, he, despite, people mourning for him and all, when you go to his final resting place, it's just like, wow, you know, it's, are you sure an emperor is buried here? And it's like, yeah, that's Emperor Meiji's grave.
Right. I don't know. I can't explain it. I don't. I've tried to wrap my head around it. The only thing that I can think of is uh maybe he himself was a humble man, Emperor Meiji, and he stipulated he wanted a modest burial. That, again, I'm thinking out loud. I can't think of anything to me that would make sense other than that.
Yeah, I definitely would have to look more too as to why he was given more of a commoner grave than, a grave of emperors. Because even his son and grandson, they have mausoleums for their grave sites. So it's like, wow, what a big difference.
Right.
All right. The next paragraph say, a few months later, the Tojo family went into its own personal mourning for General Hidenori Tojo, who finally succumbed to heart trouble. The general died at the age of 57, an extraordinary man in his own right, whose rise from modest origins to high rank and distinguished service typified the fantastic change and progress of the Meiji era. As with Nogi, there was a certain melancholy appropriateness to his death as the era ended. Whatever else Japan had achieved in the Russo-Japanese War, it had left no doubt of its claim to acceptance as an international power, which was confirmed at the outbreak of the First World War in Europe by the Japanese entry on the side of Britain and her allies, among who were included Japan's erstwhile enemy, Russia. For Tojo, personally, the war was as much a case of history repeating itself. At the time that war was declared, he was still at Staff College. By the time he passed out in 1915, it was quite obvious that Japan's participation in the war was going to be almost entirely by Navy, leaving the Army on the sidelines with no role to play. Boy. So, once again, it's almost like you get a chance to prove yourself on the stage, and right before victory is at hand, just take it away from you.
Yeah, inter-service rivalry has always fascinated me. You know, Marines always go at Army and Navy, and Navy always goes at the Marines, and everybody goes after the Air Force. So inter-service rivalries are funny, and even during the Second World War, you know, Admiral Tojo was always trying to put limits on Admiral Yamamoto, because even though the war was largely being fought by the Imperial Japanese Navy, Admiral Tojo felt that the Navy was getting too much shine, for lack of a better word. So it's funny. It's funny. You would think that the brilliant commander Admiral Yamamoto was, and all the successes that he would have been given carte blanche, but he literally never was. Funny enough, Pearl Harbor was the last time he was actually given carte blanche, ironically.
Indeed. And the mere fact that, as a brilliant man he was, especially from a naval tactician, several times this man had to kind of like threaten to retire if his superiors, which included the army, did not agree with his plans. So it's almost like the man was just not respected by not only some of his elders within the Navy, but even from the army. It's like, oh, what can this man do? Like, his plans are just not practical or not ideal. And it's always like, well, okay, if you're not going to follow through with this, I'm just going to retire. It's always like, oh, okay, all right, we'll somewhat follow through and everything.
Yeah, it's funny. So when Admiral Yamamoto became chief of naval operations, commanding officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, so in every other country, as commanding officer of the Navy, he reports directly to President, Prime Minister, Emperor, Prime Minister. But in Imperial Japan, General Tojo basically engineered it or maneuvered it, so Admiral Yamamoto had to end up reporting to him. He had to go through him to get to, which is unusual of any country's military, but I digress.
Yep, indeed. Next paragraph, it says, for Japanese leaders, the war convulsing Europe was a distant affair. In the Pacific, Japanese naval forces, quite legitimately within the context of hostilities, occupied German-held islands in the Pelew, Caroline, and Mariana groups, islands like Truk and Saipan. From these, Japanese troops were to be blasted out 30 years later, but at the cost of many thousands of American lives. More significant was the opportunity the war gave for Japan to consider the possibilities in China. There, at a time when the colonial nations of the West were locked in a life and death struggle, the Japanese had a free hand that was too good not to be tried. They took the German-held port of Tsingtao, and soon afterwards, the Chinese were presented with a series of, quote, requests, which, if granted, would have made China virtually a Japanese protectorate. Those who led Japan at the time might have seen, and far-sighted Japanese did see, danger signs for the future in reaction to what became notorious as the 21 Demands. China, now a republic and with nationalist feeling rapidly growing, vehemently opposed further Japanese usurpation of its sovereignty and territory. Britain warned its ally of the consequences of overreaching itself. Japan might have risked disregarding both of these countries, one weak and the other pitting all its available strength against Germany. But from America, strong and not yet at war, came the sternest protests. The most extreme of demands on China were dropped, though not without virulent criticism by the ultranationalists of the alleged cowardice of the Japanese government and of, to them, this additional proof of America's hostility towards Japan. All of this, Captain Hideki Tojo was aware of as a spectator. Apart from a short spell in Siberia as a member of the Japanese contingent in the short-lived and ill-conceived Allied intervention against the Bolsheviks, who had seized power in Russia, he had served out the war in routine staff and regimental posts. But the captain's dogged and efficient service had not gone unnoticed. In the higher echelons of the War Ministry, where he had briefly occupied a junior staff officer's desk, Tojo had been selected for an assignment that would remove him for a time from the routine of ordinary military life. So, that concludes chapter 6, and that also concludes pretty much this first portion of Hideki Tojo. And this has been interesting. We kind of see as far as Japan's place in being built up into an international power. It's almost complete victory against the Russians if it wasn't for a backhand sue for peace. And then also its place in the First World War, which it didn't mention too much the fact that the Japanese also wanted to try to create some sort of equity within the Treaty of Versailles in the League of Nations, but the Americans decided, we're not going to follow through with the equity stuff. That just boiled more so with the Japanese that the Americans were their true enemy. And once we kind of get more and more deeper into these countries in the 20s and all, we're really going to see how these hostilities build up. But your thoughts, good sir?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because there was the naval treaty that limited the size of fleets, limited the sizes of battleships, and as we know, both the Japanese and the Germans said, "Yeah, okay, go stick that where the sun doesn't shine," and built the largest battleships ever built. But again, it's fascinating from a historical standpoint to see how the events after World War One really set the stage for the feelings of nationalism of both countries, Japan and Germany. And when I say that, the rampant poverty, the hyperinflation, the feelings of nationalism, wanting to change the national focus. But I say all of that to say, and I'm going to repeat this again. Japan was nuked, not once, but twice. Nuked twice. And within 40 years, worked itself to be one of the top 5 powerful economies on the world in the mid 80s. Going into the 90s, even to the early 2000s, if memory serves correct, 9 of the top 10 largest banks in the world were Japanese banks. Let that sink in. This should be a case study for what you can achieve through proper mindset. But it's been a great show. It's always a pleasure, as always. And for those out there listening, I hope you learned something.
Yep, indeed as well. Well, being that it was only 2 chapters left and everything, before we end this series, I was able to find an early speech of Hideki Tojo, and this was actually a speech that happened around the 30s when he gave it. But it was interesting in regards to how he felt the Japanese government needs to be involved in nationalism and how to be taken more seriously on the international stage. And so again, it kind of preludes into what we're going to start doing this summer, where we're going to look at, the cultures of these nations and how they truly felt. We got a glimpse of it in regards to reading the backgrounds of these figureheads. But now that we're getting into the 20s, we're really going to take a pulse as to what these nations were feeling, why they did the things that they did, and all, and even some of the people within these cultures that would have significant effect on the figureheads that we're going to continue talking about.
Well, the thing is there, my friend. We will be destroying people's narratives, and people hate to have their narratives destroyed.
Oh, I look forward to it. To be,
Absolutely.
I'm just like, hey, you're not gonna find all of these in the classroom. So if you get upset because you wasn't taught this in the history books or in your history class, hey, don't take our words for it. Do your own research.
Well,
You're
to quote the great Thomas Sowell, um, compared to what? Where's your empirical data, and how much will it cost? If you can't answer those three questions, you're you're spitting hot air.
Yep, indeed. So this speech is only just a minute long, and so this will kind of give you an idea of what Hideki Tojo really felt when it comes to nationalism. So without further ado, let's listen in.
帝国の来るところは第三国が帝国のとする品事変の関水を妨害せざること、第二は帝国を要する諸国家が帝国に対する直接軍事的脅威を行われることはもちろん、経済封鎖のごとし適正行為を解除し、経済的正常関係を回復すること。第三、欧州戦が拡大し、河南の東亜に波及することを極力防止することであります。以上、参考にわたる目的が外交交渉によって貫徹されますならば、一人帝国のためのみならず世界平和のため誠に幸いであると信ずる次第であります。
And,
You know, again, I just want to say, any person under 30, you know, you did not you grew up in a very PC world. Even listening to that speech by General Tojo, the propaganda, the negative propaganda against Japan, that was it. It's like I'm listening to that speech and I'm hearing the mockery and the negative stereotypical propaganda of the age from the 40s, the 50s, even up into the 60s, when you mocked Japanese people. That's exactly how you sound. That's what the term you were either during that time the derogatory terms were a Jap, a Nip, or a Tojo, because they used General Tojo as the basis of the form for the negative propaganda and the negative stereotypes.
yep. And to me, I'm glad that at least in today's time, a person can get a hold of these speeches. Because rest assured, especially once we kind of go more into these political careers of these figureheads and all, we're definitely going to play more of these speeches and videos into their lives and all. Because again, this is things where they're not going to outright show you within history classes or your history courses and all. You really will have to do these research on your own. Really delve into the first-hand experience, second-hand experience of the people who have lived during these time periods. And even with a speech like that from Hideki Tojo, and I'm just speaking for Sigma Jones here, I'm even fascinated to really just see that for this individual, this is what he thought and believed. You know, he's not just saying something in regards to the masses and all. He really felt that this is what Japan should be all about when proving itself on a national stage, international stage. And to me, I really want to also view the speeches from these other figureheads to really see what was the message they were really trying to put out for their respective hosts and nations.
You took the word, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, I was just about to say the same exact thing. So,
Hey, like minds think alike. That's why we
yes, sir.
got the series.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and that's why, like I said, the whole basis of the war room. Like I know a lot of World War II podcasts and channels. They really dive deep into the events of World War II, as far as things that did this and that and everything. And don't get me wrong, I'm looking forward to that aspect too. But I also really want to make sure that we have faces and we have traits of the people who are going to be involved in these major events within World War II. So that way, when we're talking about the Battle of the Bulge
Mm,
or the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the
mm.
Battle of Stalingrad, you can look at these battles and be like, aha, so that's why Hitler did that, or that's why Mussolini or Stalin did this. So you're not left asking yourself, what was they thinking? Why would they do such a thing?
Like the Channel Dash, which proves throughout the entire war, Germany had a far superior navy to anything the Royal Navy had. But what they didn't have were the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
One on one, the British Navy could not touch German destroyers, cruisers, or battleships. But they didn't have the numbers. You know, a battleship is supposed to go out 3 or 4 battleships or more, 10 destroyers, 6 to 8 cruisers, 1 fuel tender, a submarine. The Kriegsmarine would send out 1 battleship with one cruiser or 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers. You're asking to get sunk. The Channel Dash was probably the first, probably the last operation where ships were properly manned.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Oh, but like I said, I'm looking forward to it, but definitely going into the summer, and for the audience that's going to listen in, when you're looking at these countries and you compare them from the past up until today's time, you're going to really see just how much it influenced this one major event, World War II, literally changed their culture in so many different aspects. And even from a military standpoint, a lot of evolutionary tactics and machines and the manpower behind them, all of that was can be traced back to these events in World War II. And that's why me and Logic's finest, we're junkies when it comes to World War II history because it really fascinates us. We just have discussions about this behind the scenes that, you know, there's more to come. I would put it like that.
You know, if you look at in the Battle of the Atlantic, the deadliest ship was the Scharnhorst,
Mm-hmm.
German ship. The Germans, superior in every way except one, they didn't have the numbers, because Hitler asked Admiral Rader, "How long do you need to build the navy that I want? Give me 5 years." Hitler said, "I guarantee you, you have 5 years." 3 months later, he gave the order to sail the Lutzow into port at Danzig and start the war. So the rest is history.
Oh yeah, and we're gonna find out why Hitler would do such a thing like that, and more. Oh, go ahead, sir.
Historians have been debating that for 70 years.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll kind of do our own digging
Right.
and come to a more conclusive idea as to why Hitler would promise his leading naval officer that he would give him 5 years to build up the Kriegsmarine, which when you look at the plans for the Kriegsmarine, wait till we
Plan.
talk up wait till we talk about the H battleship classes.
Oh my God. A battleship the size of an aircraft carrier. 24-inch guns. Just massive, massive.
Would have made the Bismarck look like child's play.
Child's play.
Alrighty. Well, with that said, we'd like to thank everyone for listening in, and for those who are listening in on the replay coming up, we look forward to the next installment, which come next month, we're going to start with talking about Germany's culture within the 1920s. We're going to look at as far as what was going on during their time, as far as the fashion, the social aspects, the political aspects, major events that were going on in Germany up until that time. So I know our our German residents here, Mr. Logic Finest, will definitely give us more insight into what was Germany's mindset during the 1920s. But definitely is going to be something we're going to really delve into.
Yeah, and we'll find out why Marlene Dietrich left a brilliant career in German cinema to come to or go to Hollywood, because she was persecuted because she was bisexual. There we go. That's why.
All right.
She admitted as much in her memoir. So it's not idle speculation.
Indeed. And believe me, we're not just going to stop with one episode. Like, for each country, we're going to get as much depth as we can about their culture before we move on to the next. So when I say we're going to look under every crook and cranny, I seriously mean that. All right. Well, with that said, I am your host, Admiral Sigma Jones. This is our illustrious co-host, Logic's Finest. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, thank you for tuning in to the War Room.
Take care.